President Trump has suggested that the leaders of Israel and Lebanon will speak to each other today for the first time in more than 30 years. He did not provide any details, but if they happen, those talks would be part of the wider effort to reach a deal to end the war in the region. The White House says indirect talks about extending the ceasefire between the US and Iran are productive and ongoing. Vice President J.D. Vance, who led the first round of talks in Pakistan last weekend, says Iran is being offered a grand bargain to restrict its nuclear program and strike a deal. Both sides claim they're making progress through mediators, with less than a week left until the current fragile ceasefire expires. On Wednesday, a Pakistani delegation led by powerful army chief Asim Munir was welcomed in Tehran by Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi. The BBC's chief international correspondent Lyse Doucet is reporting from Iran on condition none of her material is used by the BBC's Persian service. These restrictions apply to all international media organisations operating in Iran. Here's her report describing her journey into the country.
Well, the airports are still closed, so driving to Tehran is the only way to get to the capital. We've been on the road since the earliest hours of the morning and we're still a few hours away, but crossing from Turkey, there was a steady flow of Iranians returning home, some of them telling us they had to come back to work, others they wanted to be with their family. But you could really feel their uncertainty. One woman even said she was scared to come back because of their uncertainty about this fragile ceasefire. And one young woman was absolutely clear. She said the ceasefire is not going to hold because she said Iran will never give up its control of the Strait of Hormuz. Driving down to the capital, of course, we saw evidence of those 5 weeks of Israeli and American airstrikes, and it was hard not to notice the bridges spanning the highway, which were still standing. But around the main city in the north, Tabriz, we did see flattened bases of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, military bases in ruin, as well as police stations along with factories. And in fact, one of the main bridges in the north had been destroyed by airstrikes, and that meant we had to take a winding rural road, a detour, and we're still on that road now. But all the while, we kept hearing those reports from Tehran that the Pakistan Army Chief Field Marshal Asim Munir has been in the capital today bringing proposals to have another round of direct talks in Islamabad, possibly within a few days, possibly extending the ceasefire, which is set to expire on Wednesday, even talk of narrowing the gaps. But what you hear is that you hear from President Trump, he wants to do a deal, but he's also preparing to resume the fight. And that's what we hear from Iran's leaders too.
Lyse Doucet there, our chief international correspondent, who is travelling through Iran at the moment. Well, our North America correspondent Peter Bowes gave us more on the view from the White House.
Yes, sounding very positive at the news conference. The press secretary speaking a few hours ago, and I think the message was that diplomacy continues. Clearly, there are no plans for face-to-face direct talks at the moment, and certainly we know that, well, 24 hours ago we were talking about the president saying that they might happen in a couple of days. It's clear that that will not happen at the moment, but the mood music in general terms coming out of the White House does seem to be positive, that if there is to be another round of talks, that they will probably also take place in Islamabad, in Pakistan, and that, well, they haven't been specific in terms of which individuals will be involved, whether J.D. Vance will be leading those talks again, but they're certainly not being downbeat in the days following the talks this past weekend, and the message is that behind the scenes these diplomatic contacts, which I think we were aware had been made before last weekend's meeting, but they are continuing, with both sides seemingly wanting to get together again around a table.
And what is being said about the possibility of the ceasefire being extended as well? It does expire, doesn't it, Wednesday next week?
Yes, It does, and the White House saying that there's actually no truth to some of the reports that it is seeking to get that ceasefire extended, as you say, expiring in the middle of next week. And Donald Trump also, although he's been relatively quiet on social media in the past few hours, actually just posting a few minutes ago about Lebanon, and we can talk about that in a second, but in general terms he's been fairly quiet, although he did give a television interview here to Fox Business earlier in the day, and he was sounding pretty confident that this war will be resolved, he said, very soon. He said again that he's sure that Iran wants to make a deal, although he did repeat some of the threats that we heard from him. He didn't frame them as threats this time, but talking about destroying the bridges in Iran and general sort of infrastructure, but not making the bigger threats to destroy an entire civilization. I think he's drawn back from that, but the general tenor of what he said was quite positive.
Peter Bowes there. Well, the war in Iran is already choking supplies of everything from fuels to fertiliser, helium and even carbon dioxide. And under a worst-case scenario drawn up by government officials, the UK could face some food shortages by the summer, as John Sudworth explains.
The Times newspaper that had this story first, its headline is talking about a summer of shortages on the shelves. Now, I think the government might want to sort of caveat that slightly. It will say in its briefings that what we're talking about here is a lack of variety in some products rather than across-the-board shortages. And they're also keen to stress that what they're talking about here are what they describe as reasonable worst-case scenarios. So this is really looking at a number of things. For example, right at the top of the list is this all depends on the Strait of Hormuz still being closed by the summer. Now, as you've been reporting there, we don't know how long that's going to remain closed. But what it does do, I think, is highlight exactly what you've just said, just how complex the knock-on effects of this conflict really are. The conflict is holding up the supply of natural gas. Natural gas is used to make fertiliser. One of the byproducts of fertiliser is carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is used in the slaughter of chickens and pigs. So the war in Iran is having these knock-on effects that may eventually start to feed through onto UK supermarket shelves, and that's what the government is planning for. One final little interesting point in all of this, as part of the contingency planning, it is reopening a bioethanol plant in Teesside up in the northeast of England. That plant was mothballed because of the Trump tariff negotiations last year, which was going to see a large amount of cheaper US bioethanol flooding into this country, making that plant no longer viable. It is being reopened. No small irony as a result of Trump's war in Iran.